welcome you at the panel Military and Technological Relations, where we will be listening to the presentations of three speakers: Professor Jolyon Howard, who is with us online, Dr. Olga Dubrovina next to me, and PhD candidate Sara Testaferi. And my name is Rok Zupancic from University of Ljubljana. There is anecdote in Russian Federation that it's easier to buy a high-tech intercontinental ballistic missile, a very good one, a solid one, than a good toaster or a good coffee machine. However, this super orужие or super weapons that has been first unveiled in 2018 by President Putin signals a Russian intention to innovate in the defense industrial field to counter the perceived conventional military superiority of great power competitors such as the United States, NATO, European Union, and so on. Four of the military systems unveiled by Putin can be described as strategic. This means that they are all long-range weapons, meaning that they possess a range greater than 5,000 kilometers. There are a couple of other things that have been a couple of other innovations, for example, the Zircon hypersonic ship launch missile, which has also been scrutinized now by military experts. And of course, Sarmat, intercontinental ballistic missile, which is allegedly, which has a potential to hit United States from below, because allegedly it can fly over the South Pole. In addition to these super weapons, there are a couple of other things where Russian Federation is trying to not to be behind the Western superpowers and so on. So the West does have some good reasons to be scared. And some of these entanglements within military and technological aspects on the axis between Moscow and the West, let's put it like that, will be presented today by three distinguished speakers whom I have already introduced. And they will discuss many things, but they will also show that the relations between the West and European Union or NATO or the United States, if you like, have not been always like that. Now, of course, we see that situation is quite complicated. Let me put it this way. But decades ago, there were good reasons for hope that these actors could have been together forming pillars of a new security architecture. So without any further ado, I would like to introduce Professor Jolyon Howard, who is a professor of European politics and professor emeritus of European studies at the University of Bath. He has held many positions at various universities, including Yale and so on. And today he will speak about, so his presentation is entitled From Euromissiles to CSDP, the EU's strategic relations with Russia and the US from Brezhnev and Reagan to Putin and Biden. Professor Howard, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for the introduction and for the invitation. I would have loved to have been with you in presence, but the timing is terrible. I just returned yesterday from 2 weeks in Thailand and my body clock is all over the place. In the following brief remarks, I have one overall message and three basic historical observations. The overall message relates to the entire period covered by the paper I distributed. 1985 can only be understood by going back to at least 1979. 1994 is the year when historical forces were set in motion that contributed to the present situation in Ukraine. From the late 70s to the early 2020s, one of the most important historical developments has been the various attempts on the part of the West to craft an overall strategy for the Soviet Union/Russia. My one overall message is that those attempts have been a tragic failure. It takes two to tango, and I'm not suggesting that the situation we find ourselves in today is the fault of the West. Russian history since the mid-1970s has been a tortuous tale of upheaval, violence, failed reforms, missed opportunities, and post-imperial confusion. But there is no question that the West, for its part, has failed to devise a viable Russia strategy that could have helped ease the entire Eurasian landmass into an era of positive sum outcomes. So that's my first overall historical point, the failure to devise a smart Russia policy. But before I go any further, I want to state very clearly that nothing the West has done over those 4 decades can justify, rationalize, excuse, or otherwise explain away Russia's war of choice in Ukraine. Putin must take responsibility before history and possibly before an international tribunal for the actions of the state over which he presides. But that does not invalidate the need on the part of the historian to understand some of the forces that have been in play. So as I said, 3 broad observations. First one, concerning superpower relations and the end of the Cold War. As the 1970s turned into the 1980s, many in the West began to think that the USSR was on the verge of winning the Cold War. The US defeat in Vietnam, President Carter's penchant for isolationism and non-interventionism, the US humiliation during the Tehran embassy hostage crisis, the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, every indicator seemed to suggest a kind of superpower role inversion. Smart people were discussing the 1975 publication, The Crisis of Democracy, report on the governability of democracies to the Trilateral Commission. This highly significant report argued that democracies would be hard-pressed to compete with an autocracy such as the USSR. 1975 also saw the Helsinki Final Act, which capped 2 years of discussions around détente and which contained 2 very different agreements. First, the inviolability of Europe's borders, which was widely seen as guaranteeing Soviet control over Eastern Europe. But second, the Declaration on Human Rights and Fundamental Freedoms, which would eventually work against the USSR. The Carter years underscored a widespread fear in the West that the Soviet Union was increasing in power and influence while the US was on the decline. And there are echoes of this in today's agonizing over the health of democracy. But the crisis over the Soviet deployment of the SS-20 intermediate range nuclear missile system, the Euromissiles crisis or the INF crisis from 1979 to 1983, seemed to many analysts to confirm these fears. The Euromissiles crisis engulfed the transatlantic partnership throughout the first half of the 1980s. West European governments rallied behind US leadership in responding, I put it in inverted commas, to the threat posed by the SS-20s, the deployment via NATO of a new generation of US missiles, the Pershing IIs and the cruisers. The NATO missiles, like the SS-20s, were highly accurate and led many to fear that a first strike capacity would put paid to the relatively stabilizing logic of mutual assured destruction. Nuclear war was no longer seen as improbable. For many, it was becoming likely. In response to this crisis, we saw a stark divide between Europe's peoples and its governments. All European states stepped in line behind American leadership, but almost everywhere, ordinary citizens called not only for a nuclear-free Europe, but also, in the words of the historian Edward Thompson, for nothing less than the transcendence of the Cold War itself. It sought, in Mary Kaldor's words, détente from below. Peace activists from the West would make common cause with human rights activists from the East. In the circulated paper, I outlined the thinking behind the 1980 appeal for European nuclear disarmament. One key argument, fundamental, was that Europeans, East and West, should jointly reject superpower confrontation and assert the joint interests of the ordinary peoples of the entire continent. And this involved recognizing that West European interests and American interests were by no means identical, and that the interests of the peoples of Eastern Europe were in no way compatible with those of the Soviet Union. So my first observation in this first period is that in the early 1980s, Europeans across the Iron Curtain were saying to both superpowers, a plague on both your houses. My second set of observations is about what I call the failed promises of the New World Order. Our bookend year, 1985, was a year of hope. It witnessed the advent of Mikhail Gorbachev, but also the second mandate of a newly benign Ronald Reagan. Astonishingly, at their 1986 meeting in Reykjavik, the two leaders came very close to agreeing on the total elimination of all nuclear weapons. In 1987, they agreed via the INF Treaty to eliminate all intermediate range systems. The Cold War was coming to an end. And out of the Euro missiles crisis, there eventually arose the first tentative suggestions on the part of European statesmen that European and American interests might not be identical, that Europe might need to think about a relatively autonomous security policy. In the distributed paper, I give a 1985 quote to this effect from the UK Foreign Secretary, Geoffrey Howe. In 1987, 2 years later at The Hague, the Western European Union stated in a landmark document that European integration would, quote, never be complete until it has been extended to the fields of security and defense, unquote. The first steps had already been taken before the end of the Cold War towards what would become the EU's bid for a common security and defense policy, CSDP. As far as the post-Cold War Russia was concerned, opinion across the Atlantic diverged. George H.W. Bush's pitch for a new world order from Vancouver to Vladivostok was an overt attempt to consolidate American global leadership. On the other hand, François Mitterrand's project for a European confederation embraced the whole of Europe and Russia while excluding the US and containing a unified Germany. This was a premature attempt to jumpstart a new multipolar world order. It was stillborn from the moment the Central and Eastern Europeans understood that its hidden agenda, not so hidden, was to delay or even avoid enlarging Europe to the east. For most West European states, deepening the Union took priority over enlargement. Europeans at this stage tended to ignore Russia. The 1990s saw further divergence in the priorities of the two sides of the Atlantic with respect to Eastern Europe. West European states were totally preoccupied with managing the collapse of Yugoslavia, which Washington saw as an unwanted distraction. The Balkan Wars, in which Europe and the US adopted contradictory policies, gave major impetus to the emergence of CSDP. The US, at least initially, focused more broadly on stabilizing Eurasia. Both Bush Sr. and Clinton sought successfully to denuclearize the three non-Russian states of the former USSR, Belarus, Ukraine, and Kazakhstan. Clinton was conscious of the dangers of creating a new dividing line across Europe and initially promoted the policy of partnership for peace, including Russia, whereby the former states of the Warsaw Pact could cooperate with NATO on projects of mutual interest. The first half of the 1990s was therefore a period of relative calm and optimism during which the outlines of a new Eurasian security order were at least discernible. Alas, there was no strategic vision for a long-term policy towards Russia. And my second observation is that in the immediate post-Cold War years, there was at least some hope that a new security order might emerge in which Europe would assume greater mastery of its own fate. My third and last set of observations concerns what I call the collapse of the New World Order. Now, 1994 was significant for two reasons. The midterm elections in the US led Bill Clinton to abandon his previous caution about the creation of new dividing lines in Europe. Partnership for peace was in effect nullified by a policy of rapid NATO expansion. The Europeans, for their part, embarked both on the quest for relative autonomy in security and defense policy and on the policy of enlargement to Central and Eastern Europe. European states in general were not enthusiastic about NATO enlargement, judging that EU enlargement should give the Central and Eastern European states sufficient reassurance and stability to anchor them to the West. US administrations of all stripes knew that Moscow was deeply uncomfortable with NATO expansion, but were confident that Russia was simply too weak to prevent it. While the EU itself henceforth aimed to assume responsibility for crisis management in its own backyard, the entire history of CSDP has been accompanied by assertions that Europe's collective defense, its ultimate existential security, remains the exclusive prerogative of NATO. But prior to the mid-2000s, it was generally assumed, both in Europe and America, that the main security challenges came not from Russia, but from failing states, failed states, humanitarian emergencies, civil conflict, and cross-border instability. In the paper, I discussed the long history of EU-NATO relations, and particularly the different ways in which different analysts perceive the optimum pathway towards European strategic autonomy. But in all this discussion, Russia was, for far too long, largely ignored. A major turning point came in 1999 when the first three former members of the Warsaw Pact, Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic, joined NATO at the very height of the alliance's war against Russia's Balkan ally, Serbia. For Moscow, this constituted a crossing of the first red line in its relations with the West, and only months later, Vladimir Putin became president. Throughout Putin's presidency, the issue of NATO enlargement has never been far from the surface. The dominant narrative in the West is that NATO is a defensive alliance and that its enlargement up to and even beyond the borders of the former Soviet Union should in no way be seen in Moscow as a threat or even a cause for concern. The dominant narrative in Moscow is that NATO enlargement posed a genuine security threat to Russia that was simply unacceptable. The literature on NATO enlargement fills many large shelves of leading libraries. The issues are very complex, controversial, and highly political, and I examine some of the key moments in the paper. I also examine the parallel process of EU overtures to the frontline states through the Eastern Partnership. This too eventually became, for Russia, a further source of grievance. We've come a long way from the perceived superpower role reversal of 1979. Over the past 4 decades, Russia has gone through many lows and a few highs. The US has engaged in disastrous wars of choice and has become internally divided more seriously than at any time since the Civil War. The EU has sought in different ways, but with limited success, to become a major international actor. Neither the US nor the EU has been able to craft a Russia strategy that succeeded in helping constructively to manage the consequences of the collapse of the Soviet Union. With the outbreak of the war in Ukraine, this is my last remark, it would seem that the prospect of CSDP acting as the vehicle for European strategic autonomy has been put on life support. NATO has become empowered in ways that were unimaginable only 3 years ago, when Emmanuel Macron accused it of being brain dead. The current war is a war between Russia and NATO via Ukrainian proxies. American leadership has reasserted itself in ways reminiscent of the Euromissiles crisis of the turn of the 70s, 80s. But this time, both European leaders and peoples seem content to embrace that leadership. The million-dollar question is, what is the strategic objective? Indeed, is there one? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Howard, for this inspiring paper. You spoke about the different narratives that are being shaped, that have always been shaped, how European and American interests are not or were not the same decades ago. However, nowadays with the let's say things development in the East, we again might have good reasons that our interests, so European and American interests, are quite common. Anyhow, now let's leave the Earth for some time, and now we will move to space with Dr. Olga Dubrovina, who is a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Padova. Her research project is entitled "The Soviet Russian-European collaboration in space in 80s and 90s. And today she will speak about the Soviet and European relations in space from perestroika to transition period. Dr. Dobrovina, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Just a second. I have to share the screen.
Now it works. Okay.
Thank you. I prepared slides because I think that the topic about technology, about machines, about advanced technology, etc., it's a little bit difficult for us, for historians. So I think that it's easier to understand what I'm speaking about with some photos. So just to explain the pictures that I chose for the first slide, on the left. On the left, it's headquarters of ESA. I will speak a lot about ESA, European Space Agency. On the right, it's two former Soviet and Russian institutions that were involved and are still involved in space researches. The first one is the Institution for Biomedical Researches, and the second one is the Institution for Space Researches. So it's, I would say, it's two partners that collaborated during the 80s, the period that I'm interested in. Just a moment. During my talk, I will reply basically to three questions. Because the topic about space, it's huge like space. So I decided to focus on three questions, even if I could speak a lot about this story of the collaboration between Europeans, between Russia and Soviets in that period, etc., and even about the history of space technology in Soviet Union. So the three questions are: the first one, what was the Gorbachev's policy? Space policy during perestroika period. So I will speak about 6 years of Gorbachev's policy. The second one, I would assess how effective and fruitful were relationship between Europe and Soviet Union in the late Soviet Union. And this last question, I would say that for me, it's the most interesting question. It's about the promoting of space technologies and rocket infrastructure, Soviet infrastructure in European markets. So how successful were Soviets in their commercial, in their efforts to commercialize Soviet space technology in European and international markets? Just two words about sources that I use in my research. Obviously, it's ESA archives in European University Institute in Florence. Then the Soviet, European, and American Free Press memoir published. I use first of all Russian memoirs written by Soviet and scientists and engineers, published in the 90s. And interviews, I would say the most fashionable part of my research is to meet people and to speak with them about their experiences. Gorbachev space policy. Before analyzing the Gorbachev space policy, I think that it's important to underline three factors that influenced his policy. The first one is the disarmament question. So the decision to face this process of disarmament influenced a lot the development of space industry. And I don't speak only about military. So before preceded me, he spoke about military space. In my research, I do my research about civil space. So the decision to proceed with this disarmament process influenced a lot the development of the civil space industry. And another observation that I want to make is the struggle for disarmament was at the same time the part of the soft power okay, of Gorbachev. So yes, of course, he talked a lot about the need of disarmament, about the risks to collocate weapons in space, on the surface of moon, etc. But let's remember that it was a part of his soft power that he inherited in the past, in the Soviet past policy. Strategic Defense Initiative impact. Yesterday we spoke about this initiative. My question was about, and I spoke with Paolo Wurzer about this issue. How was strong the influence of this policy, American policy, on the Gorbachev's choice to start to proceed with his disarmament policy. And well, he spoke about the American side. My question was about what Soviets thought about, how they perceived this threat from American side. So my question is not if it was feasible or not feasible. The question was how it was perceived by Soviet side. There were basically two opinions. The first one expressed by military engineers, that they believed that Americans really arrived to this level of technology, of the technology development, and they will succeed to build this system, strategic defense system. But there were Russian physicists and headed by Velikhov, Evgeny Velikhov. He was vice director of the Russian Soviet Academy of Sciences, and they were very skeptical about the feasibility of the strategic defense initiative, but they weren't heard. And in 2005, Shevardnadze gave the interview to the Russian journalist, and he described how the decision was taken. So he said, we heard our economists, we heard our militaries, we heard our engineers and scientists, and we decided that we have to go ahead with the disarmament process because we don't support anymore economically, first of all, the building of the system against the strategy to defend Soviet territory against eventual strategic defense American system. Another factor that I think that it's important to remember when we talk about Gorbachev's policy is his fear of weakness. He was very criticized, strongly criticized at home because of his decision about disarmament. And if you analyze his speeches, the photos was taken during his visit to Togliatti, where he spoke with engineers and where he spoke a lot about not about weakness. He used this concept of weakness, but he spoke about strongness, strength, Soviet strength in this decision to proceed with disarmament. So he had to find this compromise between the pressure of the economy on one side and between the criticism of weakening national security through the disarmament expressed by different forces inside Soviet Union. So taking into account all these considerations about the reasons of his policy, so the start points, I call them start points of Gorbachev's policy, I would analyze his role in the development of the space industry in the second half of 80s. The first point is his heritage. So he in 85, when he became secretary, the first secretary, he inherited a very huge, really huge experience of rocket, missile, space industry. Just the second slide is just some photos and a list of the most successful project that Gorbachev inherited in the 80s. The first one maybe less known in the West, success at Venus. Venus was a Russian Soviet planet with different, there were more than 10, I think 16, I don't remember the exact number of spacecraft sent to Venus, okay? The international lead in the frame of the Halley Comet mission, I will talk about this mission later, the constant renewal of orbital stations. So we remember about Mir, no, that was launched in 1986. But before Mir, there was Salyut 6, there was Salyut 7, and all these stations were launched in 80s. So the continual renewal of orbital stations. Proton launch. The Proton launcher, we'll speak later about Proton. Proton, in the most at that time, it was the most successful rocket in the world, because it had in fact the rate over 90% of success launches. And the photo that you see here, it's not shuttle, American shuttle, but it's a Soviet Energy rocket, the most powerful rockets in the world in that period, and the Buran space plane launched in automatic way in 88, the only one launched, and then we will see the his destiny later. So another observation about Gorbachev's role is that aerospace sector in 80s wasn't anymore the priority for his government. So the photos is just to say, the pictures just to say how he was occupied elsewhere and not in space industry. No, because he was too much involved in domestic and foreign policy. We talked a lot about yesterday, so I won't explain why his head wasn't inside Baikonur, but was even abroad. We know that Gorbachev was the first Soviet first secretary of the Communist Party who made so many visits in abroad. So he spent a lot of time abroad and not inside the Soviet Union. Another interesting fact about Gorbachev and his role in the policy is that he, the only once he was in Baikonur, he wasn't personally involved. He was patient about space. So you can imagine, if you remember Khrushchev, he was crazy about space. He loved space. He dedicated a lot of time to space. If you Google, I don't like to this verb Google, but if you Google Khrushchev and cosmonauts, in Russian obviously, Khrushchev and cosmonauты, you find a lot of pictures about Khrushchev who hugs cosmonaut, not only Gagarin and the second one, Titov, but with a lot of cosmonauts with Khrushchev. Brezhnev, the same. A lot of photos with Brezhnev and cosmonauts. And you don't find pictures Gorbachev and cosmonauts. I tried so many times, I didn't succeed. So the only photo that I found is his visit in 87 in Baikonur. Why did he go to Baikonur? He went to Baikonur because the decision to close some military space programs was taken. So he went there to announce about this closure. Okay, and when the interview that I made with the Russian cosmonaut, he said that when Gorbachev saw all these rockets, all these missiles, all this infrastructure in Baikonur for the first time, he said, "What did I do?" So the quotation was I didn't know about all these things, so otherwise I wouldn't take this decision. So he wasn't personally involved in space sector. And this very sad photo, in fact, this photo of on one of the models of Buran. There were different models. The one was used in Gorky Park for different years. Another one, maybe you heard about last year, there was some news about this model that is still in Kazakhstan, in Baikonur. So the space wasn't used like in the past in the Soviet Union as a tool for national security, no, but was used as a propaganda tool. Okay, in my opinion, during the Soviet period. The second question that I wanted to discuss here is the relationship between ESA and Soviet Scientific Organization, IKI, Institut космических исследований, and Institute for Biomedical Problems. The most important Soviet institutions that collaborated with ESA, I repeat, European Space Agency. What were the conditions and reasons of cooperation? I want to just to underline that the first agreement between ESA, but not between ESA, was created in 1975, but the ESRO, the organization that preceded ESA, was signed with the Soviet Union in 1971. Okay, from 1971 to the end of 70, there weren't any important scientific project, okay, carried out by Soviet and European institutions. So it was some visits, some small collaboration, some exchange of data, some participation in conferences, but there wasn't any interesting and important project. The decision of ESA collaborate or not, and to what extent with Soviets was determined by the Soviet-American relationship. It's very clear from the from the papers that I find and read in the European archives. But at the same time, even the relationship between ESA and NASA are very interesting. But there is a researcher. South African researcher John Crick, who dedicated a lot to this question. Even the competitiveness between ESA and NASA pushed the Europeans to collaborate with Russians, because they said, well, Americans collaborate with Russians, so they have so many profits from this collaboration. Why we can't collaborate with Russians? So we want to go ahead and to collaborate with them. So these competitive spirits with the Americans. And then the end of 70s, beginning of 80s, it was the very interesting change in Soviet attitude towards the collaboration, the gradual openness towards the collaboration with Europeans. But still, I suggest that compared with Soviet-American and Soviet-French relationship in space, Soviet-European relations were inferior in intensity and effectiveness. The first step, well, I skip up this part. Two most important fields of collaboration. For me, the most interesting is life sciences. Okay, maybe the most comprehensible because it's easy to understand things about monkeys, and then about astronomy, etc. So life sciences. Just to make you understand how length and how to say. Cautional what the European approach. Yesterday we spoke about European Parliament. Now we spoke about European institutions in their approach towards Soviet collaboration with Soviet institutions, etc. But is it the same? It's the same approach, very lengthy, very attentive. So it's not like Americans, it's looking like French that pushed and they went ahead in collaboration with Soviets. The first Soviet Bion satellite was sent in 1973. Okay, the third in 1975, and on the board of the third Bion there were already American and French instruments, scientific instruments. Europeans, for the first time, they took this decision finally to collaborate with Soviets on the Bion satellites in 1987 for the first time. 1987, then 1989, the third one, the second, and the third one in 1992. I didn't write it. Even if it was important for them, because I remember you that until 1979, Europeans hadn't their own rockets, their own missile. Just in 1979, the first Ariane. And they hadn't their biosatellites to launch in space. So the opportunity to go in space and to send their instrumentation was very important for them. And they collaborated in this field with Americans. But let's remember that 1986, it's the dramatic year for American space story. No, it's okay, 3 minutes. I go ahead. So from 1986, Europeans, they can't collaborate anymore with Americans because Americans, they canceled their space program because of the explosion of Challenger, and they moved to Soviets. Another very important field of collaboration was, in fact, space science, Comet-Halley mission. I won't speak about this. If you want, I will reply to your questions. And just after the end of the mission, it was 86. It was European, Soviet first joint project. Just the year after, they launched together Phobos, another 2 spacecraft that the mission failed, and it was very big failure, very big problem for Russian, for Soviet space industry, because their European partners, they began to understand gradually that there were huge problems inside the Soviet space industry. Difficult of Soviet-European cooperation, I go ahead, and I want to arrive to the commercial collaboration. That I think the most interesting question. Obviously, Soviets from the beginning of the from the end of 70s, they started to think in market way. They started to think how we can use our advanced technology, space technology, in order to gain some money, okay? Because we need money, we need currency, etc. But the problem of the collaboration on commercial basis with Europeans too, and I don't talk about only about Europeans, but Americans, about India, was the COCOM. The most important problem was COCOM, Coordinating Committee for Multilateral Export Controls. So every Soviet attempt to send, first of all, Proton launches, to send rooms on satellites, to send services from communication satellite, from Earth observation satellite, was the prohibition from COCOM. Okay, and in fact, in the free press, you can find this quotation of Soviet engineers that wrote about the jealousy for competitors. Okay, from American side. And just to finish commercial collaboration, so in '85 the GlavCosmos was created. It's a sort of it's organization inside the Ministry for General Machine Building that coordinated all the commercial activities. So somebody called this its agency. It wasn't space agency. Just remember that there was only 25 people who worked inside this organization. So it was focused on the commercialization of space technology. This slide is about success of GlavCosmos success. So they succeeded to sign some contracts with Germany, with a German private company to launch the first Indian satellite. Was launched on a commercial basis. So not European satellite, not American, but Indian. The first Japanese journalist who was sent in '90, the Austrian cosmonaut, was sent for money. So if 2 French cosmonauts was, you remember, no? Jean-Luc Chrétien, the first European sent in space was sent with Soviet rockets, but it was on no basis exchange basis. But the Austrian cosmonauts paid his ticket to space. But there were failures. The GlavCosmos failures, and they were explained for time factor. Well, time factor because the Soviets arrived too late on the international market. That was already monopolized by Americans. Bureaucracy remained hidden, so the Europeans they weren't happy about the procedures, hidden procedures of bureaucratic procedures in the Soviet Union in sufficient space infrastructure. So they thought a lot about missiles, they thought about how to launch, but they didn't thought about how to walk on the ground, on the earth. Inadequate legal support because Soviet they didn't have experience. Yes, I finished. And the last question is about export control, American laws, American international laws. I thank for your attention. If you have question, because so many information. So if you have question after, I will be happy to reply. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Provina. This was really interesting to hear. It's interesting to note how engineers and experts who are actually focused on improvements and so on are significantly less burdened and would like to avoid these geopolitical struggles. However, their destiny is that they have to work in these frameworks. I'm saying this because when we do my research focuses on the Western Balkans. And it's very interesting to note how, for example, cooperation between Croatian and Serbian policemen is very good, actually. And so I mean, quite similar to the cases here when experts of both sides, so to say, would really like to do something together. However, there is always geopolitics behind, and it cannot be avoided. Okay, thank you very much. Now we go to the last presentation, which will be done by Sara Testaferi. Sara is a PhD candidate at University of Fribourg in Switzerland, and today she will talk about the Western European Union, so one of the institutions that is, in my opinion, lacking. I mean, the research on it is lacking. So the niche that is going to be filled with Sara's doctorate is definitely an interesting one. So Sara, the floor is yours after we solve some technological issues.
Okay, thank you, Professor. Let me first thank the organizers for accepting my proposal. It's an honor to be here. Today, I will talk about the Western European Union and its effort to build a Western European and then pan-European security dimension. So we'll start with a quick recap of what the Western European Union was. It was an intergovernmental organization born in 1954 after the failure of the European Defence Community as a means to promote the European unification in the economic, defence, cultural, and social fields. It then lost much of its competences to the advantage of other institutions and basically remained with defense competences, a close link with NATO through Article 4, and armaments control tasks. It had this Article 5, which maintained a certain importance because it was a mandatory mutual defense clause, but otherwise, the organization was slowly forgotten and remained dormant until during the 80s, for several reasons, Western Europe started to feel the need to make its voice heard in security and defense issues, and the WEU became the means for this assertion. This revitalization process would allow Europe to lower the dependence to the USA and to propose its vision also in East-West relations. In particular, in the direction of assuring peace and dialogue with the East. In 1984, with the Rome Declaration, and in 1987, with the Hague Platform, Western Europe confirmed the will to increase European integration, enhance cooperation to the advantage of the alliance as the European pillar of NATO, and to promote concrete improvements for the benefit of all people in Europe. This process allowed the WEU to resurrect as an international actor, but in the part of the sidekick of both the EC and NATO. So the new role of Western Europe in the international system seemed recognized by the invitation of a delegation of the WEU Assembly to visit the Supreme Soviet in April '87. This was quite an important event, which probably can be included in the new Soviet thinking toward the European phenomenon. A fruitful cooperation was inaugurated and involved the exchange of delegations, information, and data. This relationship continued after the fall of the Soviet Union, but changed in intensity, and we will see this later. After the fall of the Berlin Wall and the birth of the new democracies in Eastern Europe, the security architecture of Europe had to be redesigned. And so there was a significant chaos as to how and to who would take the charge of it. The Conference of Security and Cooperation in Europe, the European Confederation idea, NATO, EC, the Western European Union. So the WEU action was directed in three main areas: to open a dialogue with Eastern European countries and to propose its model of shared security, to be an actor in the arms control process, and to become an operating organization capable to act in activities completing NATO's tasks. So I will focus only on number 1 and 2, because the third is the most known and already analyzed. So the first point, at the beginning of the 90s, it seemed that the EC, that was the first option for the Eastern European countries, busy at negotiating the single market, and the political union could not accept new members from Eastern Europe. However, after starting the negotiation of the Europe agreements with Hungary, Poland, and Czechoslovakia, the prospect was that the EC accession would have granted indirect defense protection through the links with the WEU and NATO, especially after Maastricht. But these three countries became disappointed by, quote, the inability or unwillingness of the community to state clearly its views on the future place of the Visegrad countries in the new European architecture and the union process, unquote. And they proposed to develop institutional direct links with the WEU. The WEU Assembly had a fundamental role in this case also in increasing the knowledge of the WEU in the Central and Eastern European countries through parliamentary cooperation that has started already in 1989 with the national parliaments, of course. In 1990, a comprehensive assembly meeting with Eastern European and Soviet representatives envisaged a new European order by only European efforts. We saw yesterday also the importance of parliament diplomacy. However, full membership of WEU was not on the agenda because it was achievable only for EC and NATO members. Therefore, the first step between WEU and Eastern Europe was the establishment in 1992 of the Forum of Consultation to discuss cooperation. 8 target countries were invited: Hungary, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Romania, Bulgaria, Estonia, Lithuania, and Latvia. The invitation of Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus was at first considered, but then excluded to avoid any possibility of competition with the NATO initiative of the North Atlantic Cooperation Council. But for the WEU, this was a benefit because it was the only Russia-free forum in which to discuss security. So with the Kirkberg Declaration on May the 9th, 1994, a very symbolic date, being the anniversary of the Schuman Declaration, the Eastern states joined the WEU as associate partners. With this achievement, they could participate in the formulation of a sort of foreign policy involving, therefore, the relations with Russia. And the WEU became a quite complete and purely European forum in which discussion on security and defense could be led. We can see this is the WEU in 1999, but not much had changed since the 1994-95. There was the Greece full membership, the first enlargement of the EU, that Austria, Finland, and Sweden became observers as neutral states, and Slovenia became partner, and the three, Czech Republic, Hungary, and Poland, once they joined NATO, became associate members, which was the status for NATO non-EU members. I'm sorry. So WEU accession granted a significant political status, providing participation, even if not in full, in the European project. However, the WEU was very weak. In fact, the Eastern European countries, quote, recognized that there was little in military terms which WEU alone could offer. So did the Russians. Unquote. This is why Russia, left outside the club, was watching these developments with equanimity, warning against the dangers of a settlement capable of causing new divisions in Europe. The WEU wanted to create a comprehensive security dimension, but didn't have enough contacts with Russia to allow it to feel part of the game. It is true that Moscow was a prerogative of NATO, but in 1994, the W was the only Western organization which had no institutionalized relations with Russia, and nothing was giving, quote, any indication of the political doctrine to be followed vis-à-vis Russia, unquote. The DW left behind the interesting direct connection with Moscow, but which lost regularity, and instead favored the creation of a European space in which to talk also about Moscow. In this sense, it is interesting to point out that before 1989, the Eastern European countries were not a topic at all, at least in the W Assembly. So a couple of quick words on Ukraine. As part of the Commonwealth of independent states, and considering the difficult relations it had with Russia during the first years of independence, Ukraine was a NATO issue. Inviting Kyiv to the forum of consultation would have imposed similar action for Russia and Belarus, and the nuclear status had to be solved. Despite this, Ukraine, especially after 1993, showed a special interest in developing relations with the W because it saw it herself as part of Eastern Europe, a wholly European country, and was fearing a more nationalistic Russian leadership in the next years. Obviously, any solution that could include Ukraine would have involved Russian consent. The second main field of activity was the armaments control and disarmament. The WU had expertise, having an agency for the task, but this was dismembered during the revitalization process. So not much was achieved in this field, just training of the inspector for the Treaty of Conventional Armed Force, some negotiation on what kind of aircraft to use in the Open Skies Treaty, and the creation of the Torrejon Satellite Center for verification, which full working took time. So at the beginning of the 90s, the W action in arms control remained of minor importance. So the W weakness was openly visible. Its member states had started losing interest in the WU, and its growth was hindered by the two main partners it was supposed to help with its revitalization, NATO and the EC, and later EU, which slowly eroded its role and functions. Let's start with NATO. The reactivation had to be consistent with the presence and primary role of NATO. This meant for W three things: a complementary role, residual tasks, to say out-of-area operations, on which the debate inside the WU had started alongside the reactivation in 1984. Number two, even though NATO could not have a veto power on the WU enlargement, US and UK tried to oppose an excessive enhancing of the WU tasks for fear of competition and decoupling. Number three, being members of NATO being membership of NATO not on the agenda, membership of WU could give a backdoor to its guarantees through Article 4 and 5. But once the main door was opened, of course, W lost importance. And regarding the EC, the W revitalization had insisted on European defense dimension with the goal of European unification. During the 80s, the WU had appeared useful, not only because the neutral states were not its members, but mostly because the Treaty of Rome did not give the EC powers in the security and defense fields yet. The use of the W seemed a ruse, and from the beginning of the revitalization, for many actors, not all of them, of course, its role was supposed to be temporary, as if a direct responsibility in defense for the community was just a matter of time. In fact, the Yugoslav crisis showed that big decisions were taken by the 12 anyway. It was the 12 and not the WU ministers who declared that no military intervention in Yugoslavia was contemplated, and as for 1991, the WU in action was giving the clear impression that the WU was totally dependent on the community and had no mandate of its own in security matters. Sum up, the WU conducted a useful transitional and support action that lost importance once the EU and NATO could eventually approach security and defense issue for the EU and for NATO find the right way to address Eastern country security concerns. Its direct link with Moscow lost relevance. WEU could not include Russia in the definition of Europe by the Europeans made inside the organization. The WEU privileged the evolution in a security structure that granted Europe from a resurgent Russia, despite the limited means it had, rather than accepting Russia, resulting in the lack of a veritable European security dialogue with Russia in the first years of the 90s. So when the WEU had a chance to gain political clout in that period. By the time, as Professor Dundovic remembered yesterday, WEU and Russia found an agreement, not much was left of the organization. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. Also, thank you for respecting the time constraints. You were just in time. Yeah, it's interesting to know today how this European Union's component of defense and security is of which the Western European Union was a predecessor. How it seems that it's non-existing anymore. I mean, we have NATO. I mean, the old news is about NATO. However, yeah, there were good reasons for European pillar to be more to get established further. Okay, now we have a little bit less than 20 minutes for Q&A session, and I'm opening the floor. I will also pay attention to eventual online questions. So yeah, please, yeah. Okay, we have a first question here, and we'll continue over there.
Thank you. My name is Professor Marinella Neri Gualdesi. I'm of the Pisa University, and I would like to ask a question to Professor Haworth. I appreciated very much your paper, and you are a well-known expert of security issues and of the relationship between NATO and the EU. In your paper, you refer to the fact that not the United States, not the EU, has been able to design a Russia policy. And you refer in your paper to the Partnership for Peace and Eastern Partnership, the neighbor policy by the EU. But there was also the NATO Russia Founding Act of 1997. And I think that's important because to concentrate also, to pay attention also to this essay, this act that was trying to build a relationship between NATO and Russia. And also because the last December, the proposal that Russian Federation made to the United States and NATO before to launch the invasion of Ukraine was related just to this NATO Founding Act of 1997. And they were asking in a way that was something to the approach or take it or leave it, the proposal to go at the situation before the NATO Russia Founding Act. Russia was asking for the retreat of all nuclear armaments from Europe without any engagement of reciprocity. So it has been a proposal that was in fact rejected also because it was presented in a way and not with the normal diplomatic channels, but publicly. So it was reinforcing this idea there was in fact something to accept or to leave. What do you think of this proposal in the sense that it's true, maybe the steps concerning the relationship with Russia after the end of the Cold War. But can we say also there is a difficulty by Russia to sketch up a European policy not influenced by a post-imperial attitude? Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I suggest that Professor Howard, you answer immediately because it was a question directly posed to you, if it's okay with you. Are you still with us? Because your picture.
Can you hear me now?
Okay. Sure.
Yeah. Okay. Well, this is a very
I think we are losing you, Professor. Yeah, now it seems that it's okay. Yeah, please go ahead.
I think the basic problem from the very outset was that Russian objectives and Western objectives, particularly American objectives, were irreconcilable. There was the whole story of the negotiations between James Baker, the Secretary of State, and Mikhail Gorbachev about what to do about uniting Eastern Germany with NATO. And from then on, it's a whole chapter of missed opportunities and misunderstandings, I think. So that the basic problem with the Russia Founding Act in 1997 was that this was something which was essentially imposed upon Russia by NATO. The legal advisors who drew up the paper are quoted in this recent book, Not 1 Inch by Mary Sarot, as having said that the NATO-Russia Founding Act, these are the American legal advisors to the American government, made it quite clear that the NATO-Russia Founding Act was not worth the paper it was written on. All that was offered to Russia was meetings from time to time. Now, you mentioned the December of last year, December 2022 proposals, the two proposals which the Russians put forward, one to the United States and one to NATO. This goes back to the mid-2000s when Russia first began to put forward proposals for a new security order in Europe. They were constantly suggesting that we had to reconsider, to rethink the whole thing. When Dmitry Medvedev was president temporarily in 2008, at the time of the Georgia War, Medvedev put forward what he called 14 points for a completely new security order in Europe. Now, those proposals were not taken seriously by anybody in the West. They were rejected more or less wholesale by the United States, as indeed were the December 2022 proposals. Now, you can say that I argued that the West in general, both the United States and the European Union, have failed to come up with a Russia strategy. You could equally well argue that Russia failed totally to come up with a Europe strategy. Russia's approach to Europe from the very beginning has been that Europe as an entity doesn't really exist. It will only deal with individual member states. And if possible, break them off one against the other. And that is, to a certain extent, still the policy today. And that also is a failure. So it is very much a dialogue of the deaf. And I don't really see where we're going at this point. I think that the prospects for a negotiated settlement are very, very slim. Certainly, there is no negotiated settlement between Russia and Ukraine. The only possible negotiation would be in a much, much broader international forum chaired by the United Nations involving China, India, probably Turkey, the European Union, America, Russia, etc., etc. Something like the Congress of Vienna of 1815 is the only way that you can get to a sensible sort of negotiated settlement for this problem today.
Okay, thank you, Professor Howard. Now we will take the question from our online community. Angela Romano, please go ahead.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. I have a follow-up question to Professor Howard and a question for Sara. Sorry. So you, Professor, you said that nobody was able to conceive of a smart policy towards Russia. And I was wondering whether you had some ideas about what this smart policy could have been, considering the situations. And as you said, the Soviet, then Russia, specific goals which were conflicting. So was there a possibility indeed to forge or propose a smart policy, or that was inevitably doomed to fail? And to Sarah, I was wondering whether you could say something about the sources you're using, I mean, for the paper, but also in general for your research. And I hope you don't take, I hope it doesn't come across as a nasty question. I'm genuinely curious and don't mean at all to undermine the subject of your research, but was anyone taking the WEU seriously as a tool? Because you said a lot, and as far as I know, and I know quite a lot, is a transitional tool, is something like, oh yeah, you can join this in the meantime. So was anyone happy with using this tool, or was just bureaucratic inertia? So we do have this organization, let's try to assign some tasks to it, but not too much, because we don't want it to be of any importance seriously. Thank you.
Thank you, Angela. Okay, so Sarah, would you go first, maybe, and then Professor Howard?
Sure. Thank you for your question. My sources for this paper were the assembly proceedings, and mostly the UK archives, especially for the years from 1991 to 1993, and also French and German sources, but the most interesting part with the relationship concerning the Eastern European countries were in the UK archives. And UK first certainly didn't take the W for seriously. I mean, I saw this quotation that Margaret Thatcher, when saw these 3 letters coming in front of her, was like horrified every time, because she didn't really want to deal with it. So I think that its importance lays mostly on the effect that it had in the European defense development, rather than in the armaments control and the enlargements to East. However, the fact that I was interested by the fact that it tries to do something and it failed again, because it seems that everything it did was a failure. It itself was a failure, because nobody remembers it, I would say. There is not much on the WEU. And whenever I read about the organization, it's it's treated like yes, it's probably true, but however, I thought it interesting that there was this window of opportunity to use it to engage relations with Russia, and it was not used as maybe it could be used. That's why I decided to analyze this part.
Okay, thank you, Sarah. Now to Professor Haworth.
It's very difficult to imagine a smart policy that would have worked. But I think that the ideas behind François Mitterrand's Confédération were useful but premature. That is to say, he understood, as did Mikhail Gorbachev at the time, that there had to be some sort of structure that would anchor Russia to the West, or that would allow for relations between Russia and the West, which would be harmonious and constructive and mutually beneficial. The problem with Mitterrand's idea was that it ran foul of the aspirations of the Central and Eastern European countries. And when we got to the meeting which was supposed to launch it in Prague in 1991, les Assises de Prague, the whole thing blew up because Mitterrand recognized that this was an alternative to membership of the European Union and NATO. But I think that the underlying thinking behind the idea of the Confédération is very similar to the underlying thinking behind President Macron's new idea for the European political community. This is a way of associating, identifying the countries, the borderline countries between the European Union and Russia, and indeed Russia itself, if Russia eventually became democratic and respectable and whatnot, we would be back to something very, very similar, I think, to Mitterrand's idea. What needed to be avoided, in my view, and I think in the view of many, many political scientists and historians who have looked at this, was creating a situation where Russia felt that it was simply rejected out of hand by the West, and that is unfortunately the story of the last 30, 40 years. If I could just add one very quick point about the WEU. The WEU's problem was that it had no political power, no military power, no administrative power whatsoever. And when it was first identified in 1994 as the forum, the platform for the European security and defense identity from inside NATO, everybody was throwing up their hands in horror and saying, what on earth are we doing? How do we solve this conundrum? This thing, WEU, really doesn't have any clout at all. And it was 2 or 3 years between 1994 and 1997 when the British and the French, in an epistemic community, decided that the only solution was to give the power to the European Union as opposed to the WEU. And that solved the problem for the moment, but the rest is history. I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you very much. Now we have one question from the auditorium. I think the gentleman over there was before. Yeah.
I have a question for Professor Dubrovina. I just wonder whether your story is linked somehow to the growing awareness of Gorbachev and the Russian elite in general that the country was falling behind technologically. If there was a problem in particular with the new information technologies. I mean, it's common to find in economic history literature that the IT technology is quite unfit to develop in a politically oppressive country, and it would be a light technology which could hardly be implemented and developed in an environment like Russia, because IT technology can flourish only from below and not from above. So in short, my question is there behind your story a more general issue about falling behind technologically for Russia? And is it important that this narrative about the non-development of IT in Russia, is it true to your mind that it was impossible to research and develop IT in Russia?
Thank you. Go ahead, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Thank you for the questions. Yes, it's a very important question, but you replied to your question more or less. Yes, I didn't speak about this aspect of the development of Soviet space industry, where the IT technologies were very important. IT technologies, first of all, we speak about computers, we speak about microelectronics. And the very interesting thing that in the Soviet Union, the microelectronics was born more or less at the same period than in the United States. So we have, I continue to use we. We had the same level of the development of these technologies, but with time, and you're right when you say that even because of the political regime, economic regime, the planned economy, that it was almost impossible to develop this sector of technologies, because you need private companies. In private companies, you need competitiveness on the market that in Soviet Union didn't exist. For these technologies, it was basically important, fundamentally important, this type of economic regime. And another problem, so the government, it's a very interesting thing, because I read a lot about microelectronics that I said was important for space technologies too, the lack of computers, the lack of ground, how to say, computers on the ground in order to manage the flights, etc. The government, the Soviet government class didn't realize how important it was, and they preferred to spend money for technological espionage. I don't remember in English. Espionage, for technological industrial espionage, and not fund the Soviet technology, the research of Soviet technologies. So it was very big mistake. Okay, so in the 80s we were very behind compared with Americans. And Roland Zagdeev, who wrote a lot of articles and books about the past of the of space technology, of space research. Roland Zagdeev, he was the director of Research Institute for Space Research, and he wrote that we missed computers when our researchers went to NASA institutions, and they saw how many computers they had, while in the Soviet Union they had only one computer for I don't know how many researchers. The machine calculation machines. In America, there were a lot of, so the data processing was very developed as a sector in Russia. In Soviet Union, we had some sector of the calculation machine, just some in all the countries. So the issue that you mentioned was really important. But another problem was that the development of these technologies was on a rather high level, but only in military sector. So there wasn't connection between civil sector, okay, civil economy and military sector. And this was another lack that didn't exist in America, where the old technologies are discovered in the military sector, in the military research closed institutions, but they were connected. The license passed, and this knowledge was transmitted to the civil institutions, and they were used in civil economy. While in Soviet Union, and it was another reason why Yeltsin closed all programs, because there was a pressure from the population that were unhappy about how many money we spent for the space technologies. We want this money here on the Earth, and we don't want to see. I speak a lot, and we don't want to spend no more money for cosmonauts, for launches, for rockets, etc. We want to eat, we want to wear dresses, etc. And in America, this narrative didn't exist, because there was connections between scientific discoveries made in space military sector and civil economy. I don't know if I replied to your question, but your observation is very important. Well, I hadn't time to mention about it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now we have already entered the dangerous waters, which is we entered the coffee break time. So yeah, we can go. So we have like what, 10 minutes more? Okay. Okay. So if director of this conference says so, then we can continue. But before taking another question from the auditorium, we go again to our online community. And Danilo Delle Fave, please go ahead.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. I have a question for Dr. Dubrovina. And I was wondering, if we see the way in which space agencies are structured around the main space actor. We see a centralized approach in the US with NASA or in France with the CNES, a more decentralized approach like in Germany, in which we don't have a space agency. And I was wondering, why do you think in the USSR, with its structure, its ideology, is the idea of centralization, the Soviets didn't manage to build a unified space agency? And for Professor Howard, I have a question regarding the approach to, let's say, former great powers. If we see in history victorious coalitions against a great power had different approaches towards them. If we think about France after the Napoleonic Wars, we see that the victor powers re-established France as a pair with this, let's say, former status in the European concert. In other cases, like with Austro-Hungarian, we have the complete collapse of the former great power. With Russia, do you think that the lack of a clear purpose toward one of the two approaches, so the idea of reintegration or a complete, let's say, destruction of the former enemy, has contributed to it? Because if you think that in the late 90s, you have in Russia with the Primakov and Karaganov, with the late Yeltsin presidency, the first seeds of today Russia fear of NATO. Why the US, for instance, withdraw from the anti-ABM system treaty? So it's counterintuitive. If they wanted to, let's say, reintegrate Russia, why at the same time do other actions that are in the complete opposite direction? It's for you for a lack of a clear purpose, or it is linked to a conflicting idea inside the US elite between doves and oaks? Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Danilo. Maybe Professor Howard, would you go first?
I'll try. I mean, there have been obviously lots of instances of trying to deal with the defeated power. The Napoleonic Wars, you're absolutely right, but it did require that France become a monarchy again. If France had continued as a republic, that might have been a problem, in the same way as reintegrating Putin's Russia with Putin still in charge, or a Putin-like person in charge, would be difficult. I think the issue to be avoided is a 1919 scenario in which the one power which was technically defeated, i.e. Germany, is required to pay for the whole war and is regarded as a punished one and whatnot. I mean, that sort of approach led more or less inexorably to the next war. And I think that the issue that we're confronted in ending this war is in finding a way which does not lead to the next war. Briefly, the answer to your question about why the United States adopted the policy that it did towards Russia, I think that the brief answer, the simple answer, is that the United States, after the end of the Cold War, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, never really took Russia seriously. Russia policy was way down the list of priorities, and Russia itself desperately wanted to be taken seriously. All of Russia's overtures over the last 20, 30 years are an attempt to be taken seriously. And the plain fact is that Washington was not taking Russia seriously. I'm not making any sort of claim here about cause and effect, but that is a constat, as the French would say, which we simply can't avoid.
Okay, thank you. Now to you.
Danilo, thank you for the question. When Europeans wanted to understand how Soviet space industry walked inside, they were shocked about how difficult it was to understand who was the responsible of what, who was what was the most important institution, who were decision makers, etc. So when you read European papers, you realize that it was a real mess in their heads, and it was impossible for them to understand. I try to understand because I read obviously some Russian sources. I spoke with Russian people who worked inside the Soviet industry. So really, it was very difficult to understand because there wasn't agency. There wasn't one agency like CNES, no, l'Agence Française. There wasn't NASA. The first Russian space agency was created in '92, and it was created with the Yeltsin's decree on the creation of the first Russian space agency. Otherwise, in the Soviet Union, if I understood well the situation, the most important organization that took the last decision for the development of the Soviet space industry was the Military Industrial Commission. Obviously, the majority of the members of this commission were militaries. Okay, so it was in the hands of militaries to decide not only for the development of military space programs, but for the civil programs too. Then we have ministries. We have at least 13 ministries that were involved in the space industry. The most important was the secret ministry with the name, a very civil, very simple name, Ministry of General Machine Building. Okay, because there were different ministries with this name: General Machine Building, Medium Machinery Building, Ministry of Machine Building. But this was the Ministry of General Machine Building. That was the most important and responsible for the development of these space programs. Then we have Academy of Sciences. Inside the Academy of Sciences, we have the council that was responsible for the realization, the development of the civil space program, and it was Interkosmos. Okay, Interkosmos created for the deliberatory for the development of the international space program, space project with socialist bloc countries. Then we have Academy of Medicine, and inside the Academy of Medicine we have this institution that I talked before, the Institution for Biomedical Researches. Okay, and for the last in '85 was Glavkosmos, that was, I talked about it, created for the realization of commercial program and realization of the programs of international cooperation. So as you understand, it was a very huge machine. It was very difficult structure, and it was for the Europeans, for the Americans, for foreigners. It was very difficult to understand who were responsible, as I said, and what. But the most important thing, and I want to underline it in my research, the interpersonal relationship was very important. So the relationship that established between researchers, between Europeans and between Soviets, and that really worked during the first half of '80s. We talked about this wave of the new wave of Cold War, but the research on biomes, for example, the research on the joint project of Comet Halley continued despite all these geopolitical tensions. Okay, and the same we have at the end of '80s and the beginning of '90s, when the personal relationship worked, when the Europeans tried to save and to give sources, to give money to fund the joint project in order to save Russian, it was not anymore Soviet, but to save Russian space program. Because they realized how important it was for the humanity, okay, also not to lose all this knowledge, all this experience that was accumulated in 40 years of Soviet space technology. I hope I replied. Question.
Okay, the last question. Okay, yeah, okay, yeah. Let's take them together.
For Dr. Dubrovina, I'm Andrea Alberti. I have a master's degree in international relations. And I would like to point out, I really appreciated your refer to the propaganda system. And I remember the famous song, Travaudoma. It was a really Russian heritage, like Kosmism, like Bogdanov and Fyodorov. My question is, I would like to know your feelings, your expectation on the decision of Roscosmos of quitting from International Space Agency from the 2024. And according even to the construction of Vostochny Cosmodrome, which will permit to Russia to not depend on Baikonur no more. And so maybe what happened here from 2022, from the beginning of war in Ukraine, and what are your expectations for the next future, even for the collaboration for ESA and NASA as well, because I know that a lot of fuels, a lot of propellants are made from Russian. And so it will maybe touch even the space exploration and the moon project for United States and China, so on. Okay, thank you.
I have a question for Dr. Testarossa. Have you found in your research any evidence about external pressure against WEU? Like, you explained to us the internal divisions and the difficult to find a common strategy, but try to explain myself better. Do you think that the Americans would allow another forum of consultation from which they were excluded to dictate, to intervene into a crucial question as European security? Thank you.
And we will conclude this. So sorry, Rocco. One question for Olga that indeed is shared with Elena, because we had the same curiosity. What were the disagreements? What were the difficulties in relations between the three agencies? You did not have time, Olga, to explain, while I think that is a crucial point to be analyzed. And a very quick and direct question for Professor Howard that I want to thank to the name of all organizers, because we are very honored to have you, Howard. I am Simone Paoli, so we had a lot of contacts, and it's a very direct question. What do you think about the northern enlargement of the NATO? What do you think about the accession, the possible accession of Finland and Sweden to the NATO?
Okay. Let's maybe, Sarah, you go first, and then Olga, and then Professor Howard at the end.
Okay, so the US did everything was in their power to make the WEU the smaller organization possible. I mean, on the one side there were the French, who wanted to try to increase the power of the WEU as the defense arm of the European Union. But on the other side, the US really didn't want it. And also in this particular part regarding the relations with the East and Russia, the reference had to be NATO and therefore the North Atlantic Cooperation Council. So everything that was outside that NATO competencies could not be important. They did everything they could to avoid this.
I will try to reply in 2 words about the expectations. I just wanted to expectations. I don't know. I can't foresee what will happen, because we don't know what will happen with this war, and now the space activity then isn't a priority for Russian state. Okay, there are other problems, a lot of other problems. What I wanted to say, and what I see now in this situation, that the collaboration on ISS continues. Okay, and from the first Rogozin, when he was still director of Roscosmos, he said that we will stop immediately. We don't want to be on board of ISS, etc. But then he was dismissed And the works continued on board of ISS, and we saw some images of walks outside the station, joint walks between Americans and Russians, and they continue to live together on board of the station. And I think that it's when we speak about science diplomacy, okay, when we speak about science to diplomacy, I think it's technology to diplomacy. It's a very good example of how during the war, during all these tensions and narratives, the real work, the real collaboration continues. And I would say that it would be very important for both sides to conserve this collaboration as a demonstration of the possibility to work together. There were another projects, and the most important is the Mars Express. Okay, Mars Express, it was a Russian project that was unfortunately cancelled. And I spoke with scientists involved in this project, and not only Russians, but Europeans too. They were really unhappy. They were really sad because they said that if we don't launch now this spacecraft, it means that it will be in 2 years obsolete. So it will be impossible. We are not scientists. We don't realize how important it was. This opportunity, it had to be launched in September, if I remember. And the fact that it was impossible, that they cancelled years of work, okay, of joint work, of joint experience. They cancelled in 1 day. So it was a real tragedy for scientists involved in this project. No, I wanted to add something else. Well, I don't remember, but so I think for scientific community, it's not only geopolitical interests. It's their work, their life. Okay. Obviously, politicians, they don't realize how important it's for them. About disagreements, yes, it was the most important slide, the most important part of my presentation, but I wanted to speak about commercialization. Disappointments were very important to understand why it didn't work, why it worked only for the certain extent. First, as I said before, Europeans were very concerned about American reaction. So they were very careful in going ahead with Russians, because they were always looking at Americans, what they would say if they continued to collaborate with Russians on that field. Okay. They didn't want to disappoint them. Okay. The Americans' partner, who were obviously their partner number one. Okay. And not Russians in that period. Another serious problem was the hidden bureaucracy, and I mentioned about this. So even if Europeans had already access to the Baikonur Cosmodrome, they could accompany their instruments there until the moment of the launch. Still, there were some information, some data hidden from them. And for them, it was impossible to collaborate, not how to say completely, but to have some secrets, some information hidden from them. So it bothered them a lot. Propaganda. They didn't want to become the tool of Soviet propaganda, because they didn't want Soviets to say, look, even Europeans collaborate with us. So they didn't want to participate in this Soviet propaganda. And then a very important moment, I think, is that ESA is an international organization. So there were different member states, and every member state had its own interests. We know that for example, France collaborated a lot with Soviet Union, and they pushed a lot in this direction. But there were states like Italy. Italy, they weren't very happy and wishful to collaborate with Russians, because they started the space career with Americans. And they always, Italians, then British, they were very American oriented. So for them, it was very difficult to take decisions in to collaborate with Soviets. So I think it's I didn't analyze still a lot this part of collaboration between ESA and the Soviet Union, but the different attitude of different member states was the very important factor in the collaboration between ESA as organization and USA.
Thank you. Professor Howard, your word is the last one. Thank you.
Well, in answer to Simon's question, obviously the accession of Finland and Sweden will consolidate even further the preeminence of NATO in the European security area. This poses a huge question about the future of the common security and defense policy, which aspired towards something called strategic autonomy. I actually am supposed to be co-writing a book with Sven Biskop about European security, strategic autonomy, but we've put it on hold because strategic autonomy seems to be the one thing which is not going to happen anytime soon. However, my final word is that the United States will continue to press the Europeans to take greater responsibility for their own neighborhood. US strategic priority is China number 1, China number 2, China number 3. And this is a massive distraction. Therefore, I think that the case for Europe eventually doing much more for its own neighborhood, the security, the stability of its own neighborhood, call it strategic autonomy, whatever you want, the case is still very strong. The issue over the next 10, 15, 20 years is going to be finding that right balance between American leadership and European capacity. And that question, which has been the question ever since the end of the Cold War, remains a central question today.
Okay, thank you very much. We all deserve very good applause for this, so thank you again. Now we are all invited to a coffee break. However, the online community cannot join us. We regret. However, have a good day and thank you very much for cooperation. Goodbye.